Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Developing a Proper Worldview. This is going to be episode number 25, and we're continuing on in our section on evolution. We've been looking at the Dr. Kent Hovind Creation Seminar Series, which is a 7-video series available on disc, or you can watch it on Google or YouTube. Each section is approximately 3 hours. We're about 45 minutes into the 6th video, and it's called the Hovind Theory, where he's just been discussing his ideas. To be honest, I can't remember exactly what we watched in the last one, but Dr. Kent Hovind does a phenomenal job in laying out the evidence for creation and showing how evolution is a lie that's promoted, especially in our schools and our universities. It's forced upon us as fact, but the real science, when you look into the actual evidence, shows that there is no macroevolution, that the Earth and the universe are young, and the Bible can be trusted. And so it's just a phenomenal series. I hope, if you're on this video, I'm assuming you've watched the other ones, because these are meant to be watched in order. So you should be caught up. And just a few more of these, and we'll be done with the 7-part series, and then we'll move on to some other things. We still got a few more to go with evolution, and then I'm not sure where we're going to go after that. I think, because we're kind of following the same outline that I followed early in my salvation of how I developed this worldview. And of course, we have to have the Bible and faith in Jesus Christ as our foundation, as the building block, so that we can see the geopolitical scheme through biblical lenses, so that we can see the way the world works through the light of the scriptures, so that we can understand prophecy and how the world is going to progress as we come closer and closer to the end days. Whether or not we're in those last days, I don't know, but we're certainly closer than we've ever been before. And we see the world moving in a direction that the Bible calls the beast system, a worldwide beast system in which all the nations come together in a one world government and worship the beast. And we're just kind of, we're building towards that. So I think after we finish the evolution section, I think the next thing that I discovered was the lies of the American political system, the lies of the left-right paradigm, the lies of the Republican-Democrat illusion of choice, how they've created this divisive mindset in America where you're either left or right, you're either liberal or conservative, you're either red or blue, and they've divided us. But the reality is that both of those parties are controlled at the top by the same geopolitical forces that are moving us towards this new world order, this immoral antichrist new world order. So it really doesn't matter who's in office, left or right, because they're just puppets, and the puppet masters above them pulling the strings all work together. So whether you have left or right in office, they're getting their marching orders and moving us steadily into this immoral new world order system. And so I think what opened my eyes to that was back in like 2004, 2005. I believed that President Bush was a Christian. I thought he was this good conservative guy. And so I was all gung-ho about Bush. And then I saw the documentary Loose Change about the 9/11 conspiracy. Blew my mind, completely changed everything. And so I think that's where we'll go next. We'll start looking into the 9/11 conspiracy and some other things associated with the American political system once we finish up with evolution, so we can show how we're being lied to. It's a con game. It's professional wrestling. It's good guy versus bad guy in the ring, but behind the scenes, they're on the same page. And that page is a new world order. They're taught this from early on in the political sphere, and they're only progressed to levels of power if they're in line with this thinking. And because we've sold this country out to the bankers and the elitists, we gave the ability to coin and issue money to the Federal Reserve System, which is an independent bank. It's owned. It's not an American government system. Congress is supposed to have that power, but they sold us out and gave it to this bank. So now we're indebted to these bankers, most of which are European nobility, European royalty, which some call the Illuminati, which is just a nickname given to the elites behind the scenes. But we're going to get into all that. We're going to look at how they rule through groups like the Council 300, the Bilderbergs, the Trilaterals, the UN, Freemasonry, things like that. We'll show how this scheme works, how the media is a propaganda tool to keep us focused on moral issues like abortion or homosexuality or transgender issues, so that we stay divided and we see each other as the enemy, and we don't look beyond that to see, hey, no matter who's in office, we always have this aggressive foreign policy where we're setting up a world empire, and we're slowly eroding personal freedoms, and we're slowly erasing the Judeo-Christian morality. So those three key goals in this pyramid scheme, those three sides of the pyramid, are always progressing no matter who's in office. And so, I really had my eyes open to that back in 2004, 2005. And then from there, it just kind of built. Once I discovered the Loose Change documentary, which we're going to watch here, and it's stunningly overwhelming evidence. Like, you cannot watch that documentary and walk away with the same mindset. That completely opens your eyes. And then I think the next big one I discovered was Freedom to Fascism, which started with just a guy trying to discover whether or not we're really constitutionally obligated to pay income tax. And when he started investigating that, he found a conspiracy that he was completely unprepared for, but not unprepared for, because he had ties with the Rothschild family, so he knew kind of sort of what was going on, but this really opened his eyes to it. So we'll watch that, and then we'll watch Road to Tyranny and Police State, and some things on FEMA to show where this country is heading, in all likelihood. But before we get to that, we're going to continue on with our investigation into the evolution creation debate. If you've watched all the previous ones, if you've watched the previous 5 Kent Hovind DVDs, and if you've watched my videos, there's no way you can't be persuaded. If you've got an open mind, and if you've watched those other ones and you're born again and you have that biblical understanding, then you know that God is true and every man a liar. His word stands firm. He is the creator. He does not lie. His word is 100% accurate, including the genealogies. And so we can add those up, and we know that the earth is only about 6,500 years old. And that's factual and backed by science. And if you've watched these previous parts with me, you know that. You know the evidence is overwhelming. It's to the point it can't even be argued. So without further ado, we'll jump into this. Let's continue on with the Hovind theory, disc number 6. I believe we're at like the 49-minute mark, so let's pick up there. All right, so here we go. 49 minutes and 42 seconds. Let's pick up.
Theory. Okay, so what about the Ice Age? Is it true that the Earth was covered with ice? Well, maybe not the whole Earth, but there was ice all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. I was just up in, I've just been everywhere. I was in British Columbia day before yesterday. Someplace where they have these large terminal moraines and drumlins, big, huge piles of rocks. You know, as I studied this for years in earth science, it's fascinating to see ice, when it melts back, leaves behind a pile of rocks. When I was in Washington climbing Mount Rainier, my sister lives out there, they had a picture of this huge pile of rocks and somebody standing on top of it in front of this big glacier. They're going to get their picture taken. You know, the man's up there standing on this massive pile of big boulders, you know, and he's smiling, not realizing, you know why that pile of boulders is there? They're coming off the top of that glacier. So his wife takes the picture just as one about the size of a basketball falls down just behind his head from about 130 feet up.
Man.
If that would hit him on the head, he'd have to open his shirt to eat the rest of his life, man. Glaciers leave behind piles of rocks when they melt back. If it's on the side, it's called a lateral moraine. If it's in front, it's called a terminal moraine. But there's no question there is obvious evidence the Earth had an ice age.
It was in Washington State.
All over
That's
Ohio
crazy.
and Indiana, on a famous drumlin where ice carved around a hill is Bunker's Hill or Breed's Hill, where the Revolutionary War started. That's formed by ice. There's no question there was an ice age, but the question is, where does it fit into the Bible? And was it really millions of years ago?
So I think I can summarize, because he'll get into the details of it. I think I remember where he goes with this, and I agree with him completely because it makes sense. So you've already heard him talk about how the scriptures talk about water above the firmament. There was water above the earth and below the earth, and so his idea is that there was this canopy of water or ice, I guess kind of like ice rings around some planets, but it would have been like it would have created a greenhouse effect on Earth here, so Adam and Eve would have lived in like perfect conditions. This canopy of water above the Earth would have protected them from UV rays. It would have kept the atmosphere oxygen rich and good weather, so that's why everything would have grown so big, and why things would have lasted so long, why they would have lived such long ages. It just makes sense because it would have been pressurized and high oxygen, like those what do they call them? Hyperbaric chambers, I think, that they use in sports to like heal injuries because it's high pressurized and oxygen rich, and just saturates your blood with oxygen. And so like I don't understand the whole science of it, but it makes sense. You know, that he shows evidence of greenhouses being used to grow with those conditions, grow super huge vegetables and fruits and plants and whatnot. So that would explain why everything got so big, why lizards got really big, dinosaurs, why humans lived so long, why we find huge fossils of monstrous insects and animals and even human bones of giants. You know, scriptures talk about there was giants in those days. So his theory is, and like I say, I agree, this canopy of water, when the flood happened, it says the heavens were open, the windows of the heavens were open, and the fountains of the deep broke open. So all that water underneath the crust would have broke through in a cataclysmic event, which would have caused, it makes sense why we have the fault lines, like an egg crack, and he talked about in the last video. So all the water shot up out of there and would have just created huge, massive, destructive tsunamis of a magnitude that we can't imagine. And at the same time, that canopy that was above the earth would have broke and brought down all that water. And so his theory is that when that happened, when that opens, it would have drugged down all that cold air from space. All that cold air would have came down with it. And because of the magnetic poles, most of that would have been pulled to the polar region. So you would have had massive accumulation of, you have all that water coming down with the freezing cold temperatures of space, would have caused an instant ice age. All that water would have froze, and that's why they find like woolly mammals are frozen standing up. Some are frozen with food in their mouth. They were still chewing when they died. They died instantly and froze instantly. So when that canopy opened and all that cold air rushed down and froze everything, it would have caused massive snow buildups on the poles, which would have reached all the way down to Kansas City, and I don't know how far up on the South Pole, but that would have created an instant ice age at the same time as the flood. So when the flood was happening, when Noah's Ark is in the middle somewhere here in the Middle East, the polar regions would have been frozen. That makes sense too, because then that makes sense how animals and people after they got off the ark could have traveled. You know, you would have these big ice land bridges and all sorts of stuff, but he'll get into all that. But I just wanted to summarize it so you can grasp the idea as he gets into the details here.
As these glaciers plow ahead, they leave behind all these rocks, and they melt back, and the rocks stay there. And all over places in Illinois and Ohio, you see these piles. If you dig down in, you hit big boulders, and they're usually rounded, smooth boulders. So what caused the ice age? We're going to cover that in the Hovind theory. And what froze the mammoths? Those big, hairy, hippie elephants that are found frozen, standing up sometimes, food still in their mouth. The Beresovka mammoth, found in 1901, was a famous one. Part of the trunk and front foot had been eaten by wolves, apparently.
Just think about that for a second. There's no evolutionary way to explain that. If the ice age occurred gradually, slowly over time through climate change or whatever, how would it have frozen standing up with food still in its mouth? That has to happen instantly. That's an instantaneous freezing.
But the rest of it was still frozen in the ground. They dug it out, put it in, it's in a museum in Russia. How do you freeze an elephant standing up? And it's not just one, I mean many thousands. In 1 year, they removed 20,000 pairs of tusks. 1 year. It's called fossil ivory. This is one right here, a small one from a baby one. I've got a friend in Alaska that goes over to Siberia. He buys and trades in fossil ivory. He carves things out of it. Amazing, beautiful little carvings out of ancient ivory that was frozen. Well, how do you freeze an elephant? It's not just one. Walt Brown's got a page in his book here about the map showing where all the different frozen mammoth and frozen rhinoceros are found, frozen camels near the North Pole, frozen bobcat. What happened? How do you explain this from a biblical worldview? Well, some of the mammoths are frozen standing up, not all of them. So they have undigested food still in their stomach and still in their teeth. They didn't even swallow their last bite. They died of suffocation. There's no water found in the lungs. And the small ice crystals in the blood indicate they probably froze in less than 5 hours. How do you freeze an elephant in less than 5 hours? I got curious about this, so I called Bird's Eye Frozen Food people in New York. I called physics professors, I called meat packers, I called everybody I could think of, butchers that might have an answer. And I said, how on earth would you freeze an elephant? I said, when I called Bird's Eye, I talked to one of the scientists there, I said, if I stuck an elephant in the freezer, what would happen? It was silence on the other end of the line. He said, you'd have a crowded freezer. I said, well, yeah, I know that, but I said, how long would it take to freeze an elephant? He said, well, normal freezers are about, 10 below, maybe 10 above zero. Probably take about 5 hours to freeze an elephant. I said, well, that's not going to work. I got to freeze my elephant in, he said it'd probably take about 5 days. I'm sorry. He said it'd take about 5 days to freeze an elephant. I said, that's not going to work because the food in the stomach's going to rot in 5 days. The acid's still working. It doesn't know he's dead. All it knows is it's acid. It's supposed to break this stuff down. I said, I need to freeze my elephant in 5 hours. They said, well, then you're going to have to find something 300 below zero, like liquid nitrogen. Well, it never gets 300 below zero on Earth. The coldest it has ever gotten. Here's a map from National Geographic. They said the coldest temperature on Earth is minus 127. That's pretty chilly. I was up in Barrow, Alaska a few months ago where it gets to 80 below zero. That's chilly. But that's still not cold enough to freeze the mammoths.
I've had it like 30 below here in St. Paul,
I talked to a guy when I was up in Alaska. He said, he told me he works in the oil field drilling for oil near Barrow. He said they drill down 1,000 feet through permanently frozen ground, permafrost, and hit trees. He said one day they were drilling and hit a tree, and they always take whatever they drill out and lay it on the ground beside it to go, develop a sample of what's down in the ground. He said they drilled straight through the top of a tree that was 300 feet tall, standing up. This is on the north slope of Alaska. Folks, I was just up there. There are no trees. We saw one tree growing in a Chinese restaurant inside, about this big. That's it. There are no trees in Barrow, Alaska. There are certainly no trees 300 feet tall. There are very few trees in the world 300 feet tall. Some of the redwoods are that size, but how do you get a 300-foot tree standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground? What happened? Well, I'm going to give the Hovind theory of what I think caused the flood in the days of Noah. We're going to give this in the next section. Mostly, just give you a few things to consider. Now, many people have contributed to this. I'll take the blame for it if it's wrong. It's just a theory. Some people say, I think your theory is wrong about this little point. Okay, then modify the theory. That's what it's for. It's to give you a skeleton to hang the meat on, okay? We're going to review a little science and then give you the Hovind theory. There's a law called the inverse square law, which says if two objects are attracted to each other, like the Earth and the Moon have gravity pulling them together, or two magnets, the force of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. In English, that means if you brought it into 1/2 the distance, it would quadruple the attraction, not double it. Inverse square laws apply when you're dealing with forces involving gravity, light, magnetism, and girls. See, when you half the distance, the attraction is quadrupled, not doubled. Many guys don't understand that. See, I travel every week. I've been home 7 Sundays in the last 14 years, which means I get to come home every week. I get 10 feet away from my wife, and it's, hello, dear, how are you doing? When you get 5 feet away, it's 4 times the attraction, not 2. When you get real close, it's just too late, okay? Overpowers all resistance at that distance. So stay 10 feet away, guys, your problems will be solved. Anyway, next thing you need to consider, when a top is spinning, it behaves in a very peculiar way. If a spinning object is struck by something, like a gyroscope, if you bump it, it'll wobble for a while and then recover spinning, but it'll be spinning at a strange angle. Spinning tops follow actually a very predictable pattern when they're struck by something. Like gyroscopes, or with the bicycle wheels full of water they would have at Dinosaur Adventureland. Come over their entire thing with our bicycle wheels. You get them spinning, and it's very hard to change the spin, but they follow a predictable path. You can actually determine when it was struck by tracing back the wobbling pattern and say, oh, it must have got hit right here. Okay? The Earth obviously has had different north poles. The Earth, the spin, to tell you the Earth, they build your globes, you know, it's tilted over 23.5 degrees. Oh, it spins this way actually. But it's tilted 23.5 degrees. It wasn't always that tilt. There's quite a bit of evidence on this planet that the Earth had different tilts. Stonehenge, for instance, probably was built at a time to worship the sun or study the sun, but the Earth had a different tilt when Stonehenge was built. Same with Edixus and Amun-Ra. George Dodwell was the government astronomer for Australia for years, back from 1909 to 1950 something. He was the main astronomer for the government of Australia. He spent years studying the tilt of the Earth from historical data. He says the Earth was tilted differently down through time. He made a graph of the tilt of the Earth when the Earth is moving. He said the Earth angle of declination in relation to its orbit around the sun is changing. He said after studying all this, it looked to him like something struck the Earth 4,350 years ago and made the Earth wobble for several thousand years. And now it's pretty stable. The North Pole's still moving a little bit, but basically it's pretty stable. But did something strike the Earth 4,350 years ago?
It's right at the time of Noah's flood.
Well, that's about the time of the biblical flood, you know. What happened? Today we're tilted over, and that's what causes the seasons. The Bible talks about summer and winter. The first mention of cold weather.
I wonder, like I've heard here recently, I think like that earthquake that caused the tsunami, they say it like knocked the Earth off its axis a little bit. So I wonder, like, I don't know what he believes, if something hit it but if God, when God brought the flood and the fountains of the deep broke open, I wonder if, imagine how violent that would be. I wonder if it didn't necessarily get struck, but the violent eruptions of the water underneath the crusts would have just, like shook the earth.
Is after the flood, Genesis chapter 8. I know there were seasons before. There was apparently no cold weather before. So keep that thought in mind. Third thing, some of the planets have craters on them. The moon obviously has craters all over the place. Mercury has craters. Many of these, Mars has craters. What happened? What caused the craters on these planets? Mars has a canyon bigger than Grand Canyon, and there's not a drop of water to be found to be proven on Mars. And there's a canyon bigger than Grand Canyon. And this article says it was carved in an almost instant Grand Canyon when a lake overflowed. Now, why can they look at a canyon on Mars and determine it was formed very quickly? And they can't look at Grand Canyon on Earth and can't determine that was formed very quickly. Here you got plenty of water on Earth, almost no water on Mars. What's their logic here? And we talk all about it in this article here that you can read for yourself about the canyon on Mars forming very quickly as a lake overflowed. I agree. I think many canyons form quickly. There's an effect in physics called the Meissner effect. A magnet will actually float on top of another magnet. If you put two north poles together, one will float on top of the other. Japanese use this for their high-speed maglev trains. The Meissner effect. All this is going to tie in what we call the Hovind theory, but you need to have a little refresher in science here. What caused all this? There are comets flying around through space, but these comets are extremely cold, like 300 to 400 below zero. Don't lick them. How many of you have a piece of your tongue stuck to a pipe or a pump handle someplace in the world right now because when you were a kid, you were as dumb as me? Okay? My brother said, I bet you can't lick that pole. I bet I can. 10 below zero in Illinois, you know. Super cold things exist in space, cold enough to freeze the mouse. Next week, we're going to cover some more of the Hovind theory of what caused the freezing of the mammoths, the Ice Age, and the flood, and Grand Canyon, and all that. So tune in again next time. See you then.
Oh man, I should have went to this point on the last video. I didn't realize we were that close to the...
Well, welcome folks to the Creation Seminar Part 6. This will be a continuation of what we covered last time. on the Hovind theory. What caused the flood? But before we go into my theory of what caused all this, we have to review a little bit of science. When we started last time talking about some of the things about science that you need to be refreshed about, the Meissner effect, and about super cold comets in space. Some of the comets, most of the comets out there in space are extremely cold, like 300 to 400 below zero. Now, next thing you need to keep in mind, if you throw a snowball too fast, it'll break apart. I know here we are in Florida, probably some of you have never seen a snowball before, but it's the white stuff, you know, it falls out of the sky. You know, not the pigeons, but if you throw snow too fast, it will break apart in space. You can't throw a snow, you couldn't shoot a snowball out of a cannon, it would break apart. It wouldn't hold together in one piece. So if a comet was going too fast, it would break apart. We saw that when the comet got sucked into Jupiter, Comet Shoemaker several years ago. They saw the comet headed toward Jupiter. It kept going faster and faster because gravity gets stronger the closer you get, the inverse square law. And as the comet got up to a certain speed, all of a sudden, poof, it just blew apart in space. There were 27 pieces that we could see from here that hit Jupiter. Who knows how many millions there actually were. But it broke up into thousands, at least thousands, probably millions of pieces. So comets are flying through space, but they have a maximum velocity where they will simply break apart. Next thing to keep in mind, the Earth has a very strong magnetic field, but the magnetic field is getting weaker. Which means back at the time of the flood, the magnetic field probably maybe even 8 or 10 times stronger than it is today. This magnetic field protecting the Earth. And next thing to keep in mind, super cold particles sometimes are easily magnetically deflected or statically charged. For instance, we have the Northern Lights. How many of you ever got to see the Northern Lights? I've only been able to see them twice. Once in South Dakota and once in Canada. I had to get to an airport, 3-hour drive to get to the plane. I had to catch the plane at 7 in the morning. So at 3 in the morning we left from the seminar to drive. So I laid in the back seat, looked out the window, the Northern Lights were just going crazy that night. 3 hours, got to watch them. It's unbelievable. If you've never seen them, they're phenomenal. You guys seen them in South Dakota? You live there. You don't get to, you got to go up at night to see them. Okay, well, they're not out in the daytime. Oh, they're out in the daytime, but you can't see them. The Northern Lights are caused by the phenomena of the particles being, or energy being deflected to the North and South Pole from the Earth's magnetic field. I think the same thing could happen with super cold ice particles. Little fragments could be deflected to the North and South Pole. Next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world was a lot different. They had a canopy of water or ice to protect them. We covered that in seminar part 2. And next thing to keep in mind, before we give you the Hovind theory, who on earth is Peleg? There's a guy in the Bible named Peleg. If you read through Genesis chapter 10, it's kind of a boring chapter. I hate to say that, but it's kind of boring. You know, it's all them names that nobody can pronounce but Alexander Scorby. And you come to Genesis 10:25, and it says, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. All the rest of these guys in Genesis 10, it doesn't tell us anything about them. It says their name, and his son's name, and his son's name, and his son's name, and all of a sudden it says, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And then it says his brother's name was Joktan. Well, nobody else gets their brother mentioned. Why would Peleg get his brother mentioned? Well, Joktan in Hebrew means shortening, and Peleg means divided. So who on earth is this Peleg? If you get the seminar notebook, the last page folds out to be this timeline. You can see Peleg on there a couple of generations after the flood. Who was Peleg? Notice Peleg's daddy lived over 400 years. Peleg only lived 239. What happened? We'll cover that in a minute. Next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world had a canopy of water overhead and a layer of water under the crust of the earth. Mentioned in Psalm 33, Psalm 136, Psalm 24. This water used to be under the crust of the earth. Next thing to keep in mind, sometimes there are 2 ways to look at things. If you remember our seminar part 4, you know, how fast was that calf going anyway? 2 ways to look at things in this world. So I made a conscious decision 35 years ago as a brand new Christian. I had kids at school making fun of me for being a Christian and telling me the Bible's got contradictions and blah, blah, blah. I went through all the typical persecution of a young Christian. And I had to decide, I'm going to believe the Bible until it is proven wrong. Some people have decided they are not going to believe the Bible until it's proven right. I think that's a mistake. One atheist came to the preacher one day and said, I don't believe the Bible. I don't believe anything in the Bible. I believe science. He said, if you can prove one verse out of the Bible scientifically, I'll believe it. The preacher said, okay. He grabbed the atheist around the neck, grabbed his nose, and began twisting his nose back and forth till the blood started coming out. Atheist said, man, what are you doing? He said, well, the Bible says the wringing of the nose bringeth forth blood. I was just proving it to you, you know. I don't recommend you do that, but it is in there, folks, okay? Anyway, here's the Hovind theory. What I'm going to do is supposed to be a good teaching technique. I don't know if it works or not, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So we'll go through this real fast, real slow, and then real fast at the end, trying to give a conclusion of what caused the flood, what froze the mammoths, why is the earth tilted, why do we have seasons, what froze the mammoths standing up. 8 points to the Hovind theory, very simple. I think Noah and the animals got safely into the ark. Number one. Number two, a 300-degree below zero Fahrenheit ice meteor came flying through space. As it got closer to some of the planets, it broke apart. And some of the fragments made the rings. Some of the planets have rings around them. Why do Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune have rings? Rings made of ice. What happened? As it got close to the Earth, some of the fragments would tend to be sucked into the North and South Pole. And so the Earth got snowed on with extremely cold, like 300 or 400 below zero snow, mostly around the poles. Now, a lot of it would vaporize, I know, coming through the atmosphere. But just like you can spray a hose right through the middle of a fire, some of it will make it out the other side. If you get enough going in the same direction, it'll develop a cold channel right through the middle of a hot fire. Super cold ice could dump in on the Earth and make a cold channel right through a warm atmosphere. If you get enough of it going at the same time, coming fast enough. Then the fourth thing happened, this dump of ice on the North and South Pole caused the Earth to crack, releasing the fountains of the deep, caused the Earth to wobble from the extra weight on the North and South Pole, and the rapidly spreading ice, you keep dumping ice in one spot, it's going to spread out. And went sliding across the countryside, carving the glacier effects that we still see today. It caused the burial of the mammoths. They're frozen standing up, food in their stomach, and they suffocated. It caused the Earth to wobble for a few thousand years. It made the canopy that used to protect the Earth collapse. Because when warm air hits cold air, it rains.
So I don't remember the comet theory part of it, but I mean that makes sense too. Maybe it was Answers in Genesis that had the idea of the canopy breaking and bringing down all that cold air. I don't remember where I saw that, but both make sense and both are theoretical. Scriptures don't tell us exactly what happened. But that's how we should build all our theories. The scriptures are absolutely true. So any theory that we have cannot contradict that. Anything we come up with in our imaginations, that contradicts the Bible is wrong. The Bible's not wrong. The Bible is perfect, authored by God, the Holy Spirit, spoken by Him, preserved by Him, perfect and pure. It is true. And so our ideas, our anything that we think we observe, our reasoning, our logic, all must bow down to the Scriptures, not vice versa. The way the world does it is vice versa, and that's where all sorts of error comes in. So if our theory doesn't contradict the Scriptures, it's okay to have that theory. But the moment we see something and our understanding goes, like you see a fossil and your thought process goes, okay, this thing must be really, old. Millions of years old. Hold on, the Bible says the Earth's only 6,500 years. Okay, my reasoning's wrong. The Bible's true. There's another explanation. Rapid burial and lithification caused fossils, and there's fossils everywhere. The only thing we know for sure is that everything died. Carbon dating says something else. Carbon dating's wrong. The Bible ain't wrong. Carbon dating's wrong. And he showed evidences for why carbon dating can't be trusted, why it's wrong. But so these theories that he's coming up with, whether it's a comet or the canopy just breaking and bringing down all that cold air, neither one of those contradict scriptures. We can't prove it, but they're both reasonable theories.
And it opened up the fountains of the deep, and the water came shooting out from inside the crust of the earth, like the Walt Brown's hydroplate theory shows. Then, during the first few months of the flood, the dead animals settled out and were buried. And plants were buried by the bazillions. And the big piles of plants became coal, and animals turned into oil, natural gas, or fossils, depending on how they're buried, and how deep they're buried, and what conditions they're buried in. That became the coal and the fossil graveyards over the next few hundred years. Then during the last part of the flood, the unstable plates of the earth would crack and shift and move around. Some places lift up, other places sink down. Water's going to fill in the low place. If we filled this room full of water, lifted up one end of the room, the water would rush down to the low end. I think the plates of the earth tilted, and water ran off.
Caused mountains and
forming the
valleys.
mountain ranges, the canyons, and the trenches. We'll cover that in a minute. As the ocean thin spots sank down, they became the oceans. Other spots lifted up, they became the continents. And the runoff caused enormous erosion. Grand Canyon probably formed in a couple of weeks. Over the next few hundred years, the ice caps would slowly melt back. This is going to raise the ocean levels slowly. That's the only thing to explain the continental shelf. Why do we have a continental shelf out there? That explains the shortening of the lives in the days of Peleg, from CO2 being absorbed by the water. And we can still see today the devastating effects of this flood. So that's the Hovind theory in a nutshell. Let's go with a little more detail now. God made a perfect world. Man wrecked it with his sin. God's...
That makes sense. One of the questions I've always had, like, how did animals get to Australia? Like, there's theories, again, and they're just theories and unprovable, that animals could have drifted on large sections, like huge islands of wood and plant and stuff. It's like, yeah, I don't know if I buy that. There is a land mass underneath the ocean running between Asia and Australia. And it's just like, it's not too deep underneath the surface. So the idea was that the ocean levels were lower and that landmass would have been available to walk across. That makes sense with what he just explained. As the ice caps, as the glaciers melted and drew back, the ocean levels would rise, burying that that land bridge between Asia and Australia underwater, trapping all those animals in Australia, which is why there's so many species that are distinct to Australia.
That I'm going to destroy it. Noah built a boat. God said to Noah, get in with all the critters. God said to Noah, come thou, Genesis chapter 7. That is a good sermon right there. God didn't tell Noah to go into the ark. He told him to come into the ark. Where does God have to be in order to say that? In the ark. That'll preach. Later he said, go out of the ark. He didn't say come out of the ark. God was in there with him the whole time. I don't mind taking a one-year cruise with all the critters on board if God's in there with me. Okay? So, that'll preach. And then the Bible says the Lord shut him in. Genesis 7, verse 16. If God shuts the door, it won't leak. Good eternal security verse. If you're in Christ, you're safe, okay? People say, think you can lose your salvation? Absolutely not. Are you kidding? I didn't deserve it before I got it. I didn't deserve it while I was getting it. I don't deserve it now. If I could lose it, I never would have it. Nobody would have it. It's okay. I'm sealed in Christ, not sealed because of what I did. It's because of what he did. So then I think what happened, Noah's in there safe and sound. A 300-degree below zero ice meteor comes flying through space and starts to crack up in space. Some of the fragments become rings around the planets. Some of them make craters. You know, a chunk of ice would hit a planet, make a crater, and then later vaporize and disappear, leaving behind the hole, but no evidence of what hit it. Ice would do that. Okay? Some planets have rings around them. At least 4 planets have these ice rings.
Had to have been a
and they're made of not only ice, but also rock and ice. Now, Walt Brown thinks that the rings around the planets came from Earth. He thinks the fountains of the deep broke open and shot stuff up into space. He thinks the comets flying around through space came from Earth. Good theory. I don't know if you can prove that or not, but it's have to go pretty fast to get away from Earth's gravity, you know. But you get supersonic stuff shooting out of the ground from rocks blasting up from the fountains of the deep. It's a good theory. It could be true. I don't know. But these comets flying around through space are certainly super cold ice. As this sections of the comet, or maybe the tail of the comet, got close to the Earth, it would be sucked in because of the Earth's magnetic field. It would be deflected mostly to the north and south poles. So the Earth got hit mostly around the poles. Some fragments might make it through, the big ones might make it through, and actually leave behind craters that after the flood would still be visible. Maybe eroded some from the flood, but there could be craters. I don't know if the Yucatan Peninsula crater is an example of that, but there could be craters, or the big one in Quebec, Canada, 47 miles across. Something huge hit Quebec, left a 47-mile crater. That could be from this ice, I don't know. But also, super cold ice is easily statically charged. We have a Van de Graaff generator at our place. You go over there and stick your hand on there and poof, make your hair stand up. You've all seen those before, right? Physics class. A lot of fun. Come on over, you can try ours. Well, here's my theory. I think a super cold ice meteor came toward Earth, broke apart. Most of the fragments landed on the poles. This caused the Earth to wobble, crack the crust, release the fountains of the deep. The canopy overhead then would collapse because super cold air coming off of this ice cap, just like when you open the freezer, you can see the cold air flow out. Well, cold air is like we get the Canadian winds come down, you know, from Canada and freeze people down in Texas primarily. There are cold fronts that move off of big masses of cold ground. That would happen at the time of the flood, and for the next few hundred years, actually, from this ice cap sending off these cold waves. It's still coming today, actually. Scientists just discovered here a few years ago, there are still massive amounts of ice hitting the Earth all the time. Earth gets clobbered by big chunks of ice as big as a house. it melts in space and ends up coming down just as moisture. But we're getting a lot of ice and water added to the Earth from this phenomenon. I think this is remnant ice floating around from 4,400 years ago at the time of the flood. This article talks about water everywhere in space. Finding lots of chunks of water, amounts of water and chunks of ice in outer space. Now, when they went, this map shows the North Pole kind of from a strange view. It shows Greenland down at the bottom, lower right, and Russia to the upper left. But it shows what the North Sea would look like without the water in it. There's an island up there, up at 10 o'clock on your map, called the New Siberian Islands. There on those New Siberian Islands, they find frozen bobcat, frozen camels, frozen bison, frozen mammoths. What's a camel doing up near the North Pole? And some of these camels are 15 feet tall. I mean, a really big camel. What happened? How do you freeze animals up near the North Pole? And why were they there? Well, I think before the flood came, the world probably had very, very small ice caps, if any, because it wasn't tilted as much as it is today. If the Earth were not tilted quite so much, we'd have almost, springtime all the time. There still would be probably small polar ice caps just because of the angle of the sun. Probably be colder weather at the north and warmer at the equator, but nothing like it is today. When they drill down through the ice, sometimes they find strange things. Like in Antarctica, they drill down, which is at the bottom of the world here. We call it the bottom. Of course, you can't tell when you're standing there, but at the south end of the world, they drill down through the ice and hit coal. There's enormous evidence of huge forests in Antarctica where there's not one tree growing today. There's not a blade of grass growing down there. Admiral Byrd said he found frozen palm leaves under the ice near the South Pole. Here's an article telling about 400 miles from the South Pole, they find dinosaur footprints. And dinosaurs. And thousands of well-preserved leaves found in Antarctica. What happened? 250 miles from the South Pole, they find frozen leaves in the side of a cliff. There are no trees there. None. Zero. This article talks about the discovery of these leaves. They have their original cellular content. These leaves are not fossilized. They're still leaves. Up in Alaska, they found dinosaur bones and dinosaur tracks in Alaska. It's cold in Alaska. Actually, there's a good book by some guys who went up to northern Alaska and found frozen dinosaur bones, not even fossilized, called The Great Alaska Dinosaur Adventure, The Great Alaskan Adventure, or something like that. We can get it through our bookstore. But frozen dinosaur bones, not even fossilized. Well, we cover more on that in video number 7. The Earth actually has 2 North Poles. We have what's called the geographic North Pole. We spin around that one. And we have a magnetic North Pole up here in Canada. Your compass points to the magnetic North Pole. Now here in Florida, it doesn't affect us because we're pretty much straight line. But if you live in Alaska, there's quite a difference. Pilots have to really watch for this angle of declination because the North Pole is not really the North Pole. And they have to allow how many degrees to change their navigation based upon, because it's pointing magnetic north, not geographic north. It appears that the Ice Age, you can look at the map here, it appears that the Ice Age is centered around the magnetic North Pole. There was more ice in America than there was in Russia, for instance. The Ice Age effects came down further. Here's what I think happened. The mammoths were up there chomping on their tropical flowers, enjoying a wonderful meal, and all of a sudden it began to snow. They had never seen snow before. So one of them said, "Herman, this is peculiar weather we got going on here. Let's get out of here." They started running around, and the snow got deeper and deeper, and pretty soon they ended up in snow so deep they couldn't even fall over. How many of you have ever been in snow so deep you couldn't fall down? You don't get that in Florida much, but you guys do in South Dakota, don't you? And the mammoths ended up standing up, suffocating in 300 below zero, super cold snow. They froze in 5 hours under those conditions. Because a large chunk of meat takes a long time to freeze. You ladies know if you freeze or thaw a large turkey or something, it takes 24 hours to freeze or thaw 12 inches. Well, the mammoths are found frozen so quickly the food in their stomach is still green, still recognizable. It didn't keep digesting after they died. As the ice would go spreading out across the countryside, it would leave behind scratches in the rock like you see in Kelly's Island, Ohio, or all across Indiana or Illinois. There are glacial grooves. Yes, there actually was an ice age. But it wasn't millions of years ago. I think it was triggered at the time of the flood. There are basically 2 theories about the Ice Age among creationists. One theory says the flood caused the Ice Age. My theory says the Ice Age caused the flood. Very similar. I think the Ice Age actually caused the flood to start. I don't think you're going to explain 5 million mammoths perishing at one time if the Ice Age came after the flood, because mammoths are a little slow reproducing. You know, it takes a couple of years to have a baby mammoth, okay? And to get 5 million of them is going to take a long time. So I think the Ice Age had to come in and trigger the flood. Then the ice would still last for a few hundred years afterwards, but probably that was the trigger. So the earth had these big cold spots. Cold air hits warm air, causes it to rain. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. The canopy that used to protect the earth collapsed, and everybody drowned. The Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. I think because of the impact, or maybe because of the weight of the earth, or the changing in the tilt, or just the near miss of a comet, just something going by, the gravitational tug would flex the crust of the earth, causing it to crack. Several things could have happened, releasing the fountains of the deep. If you get the book of Jasher, we sell it in our bookstore. I don't know that this is the one mentioned in the Bible, okay? There's a book of Jasher and a book of Enoch mentioned in the Bible. There are some floating around in circulation. Neither may be legitimate. It appears the book of Enoch is actually a forgery by one of the cults who wanted to document, to say, well, the Bible says right here.
FYI, don't trust any of the extra biblical books. God promised to preserve his word. He gave us his supernaturally protected word in purity and perfection. You don't need to go outside the scriptures to get any biblical information. Those extra biblical books can't be trusted. They're not canon for a reason. Canon meaning part of the 66 books of the Bible.
You know, certain doctrines, things that they teach. So they wrote their own book of Enoch, knowing nobody ever found the book of Enoch. Book of Jasher may be that way too, I don't know. But it says in Jasher chapter 6, on that day the Lord caused the whole earth to shake. And the sun darkened, and the foundations of the earth raged, and the whole earth was moved violently. And the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared, and all the foundations of the earth were broken up. Fascinating book to read. If you want to get the book of Jasher, it's like $10 in our bookstore. But I think this is another description of what happened at the time of the flood. The earth actually broke apart. Something caused it. Walt Brown says the earth was stretched, over the water. I agree, but he doesn't have a mechanism. And I talked to him about it. I said, what caused the earth to crack? He said, I don't know. It just did. Well, maybe so. But I think, outer space meteor strike is one possible solution to that. So this dump of ice on the poles caused the earth to crack. That released the fountains of the deep. The rapidly spreading ice caused the ice age effects. It caused the burial of the mammoths. It made the earth wobble for a few thousand years, and it made the pre-flood canopy collapse. It rained 40 days and 40 nights, and the earth was completely covered by water. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 7, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. This is not a local flood. When I debated Hugh Ross on the John Ankerberg show for 3 hours, I said, Dr. Ross, do you believe in a universal flood? No, I said, do you believe in a worldwide flood? He said, I believe in a universal flood. Now, I know what he really believes, and I thought that was a deceitful answer. I said, what do you mean a universal flood? He said, well, it flooded Noah's little universe, which was the valley that he lived in. There was no reason to flood the whole world, he says, because, why kill the penguins? They didn't do anything wrong. Well, that sounds good, but it's not scriptural, okay? The Bible says the hills were covered. The whole mountains were covered. If you shrank the earth down to the size of this 12-inch globe, all the water in the oceans would not even fill a tablespoon at this scale. I mean, I flew back over to the Pacific. I told one of the guys in my office, I said, man, the Pacific Ocean is huge. And he said, oh, that's just the top of it. That's quite a thought. But even though there's huge amounts of water on this planet, when you shrink it down to this scale, it won't even fill a tablespoon. 3 miles of water spread over the world is thinner than the paper on this globe at this scale. This is 8,000 miles across the earth. 3 miles compared to 8,000 is nothing. And if you smoothed out the earth right now, if you just smoothed it out, push the mountains down, lift the oceans up, level everything out, there's enough water out there right now to cover the earth 1.5 miles deep. Everywhere. People say, where'd all the water from the flood go? Oh, it's still here. It's gathered into big puddles called oceans. The water's still here from that flood. And the Pacific Ocean is gigantic, and that's just one of the oceans, okay? When they climbed Mount Everest in 1953, they began to find something strange up near the top of Mount Everest, the tallest mountain that we know of in the world. They began to find petrified clams in the closed position. Petrified clams on top of Mount Everest. Up in Peru, 2 miles above sea level, recently they found giant oysters 11.5 feet wide, weighing 600 pounds. Petrified oysters in the closed position. Now you can walk along the beach here in Pensacola and find 1 billion seashells. You hardly ever find a matched pair, and you never find them closed if they're dead. As soon as they die, they open. How do you get petrified clams in the closed position on top Mount Everest? Well, Your Honor, I'd like to argue, first of all, that Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach. Okay, right there. Number two, clams don't climb mountains very well. Number three, when a clam dies, it opens. So how can we explain petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest? One atheist I debated said, "Do you think the water covered Mount Everest?" I said, well, Mount Everest was underwater, but Mount Everest wasn't there. The mountains actually arose during the last part of the flood. Sometimes they find petrified clams in beds up to 10 feet thick. Solid petrified clams. 10 feet. A guy in Alabama, I spoke up there in his church in central Alabama. He said, "Hey, you want some more petrified clams?" I said, "Yeah." "Why?" He said, "They're 4 feet thick in my backyard. Every time I rototill my garden, I bring up thousands of petrified clams. Closed. I got a bunch of them here, little tiny ones. Petrified clams in the closed position." I think that's evidence they were buried alive in mudslides, which would happen during the flood, and they woke up dead, couldn't open. And ended up petrified. It doesn't take long for things to petrify. Petrified eggs are found, like this picture here shows. We got 3 dinosaur eggs on the table. You can come see those are real petrified dinosaur eggs. Petrified jellyfish. Petrified octopus arm. Soft-bodied creatures just don't petrify today. They get eaten by somebody. Even animals don't petrify in the jungle of Africa. They get scattered all over the place. You know, the bones are dragged around, and even the bones get chewed up. What happened? Well, the Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. I think the earth got hit, it wobbled for a while, and it cracked apart, and the water underneath that used to be there, mentioned in Psalm 136 and Psalm 24, came shooting to the surface. Then, this dump of ice would cause all these effects that we talked about, and the earth, the canopy would collapse. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. We still have the scars today where the earth broke open. They're called the fault lines. And you can study earth science from this perspective, and it makes a whole lot more sense, I think. The hot water coming out from inside the crust of the earth would hit the regular water and kill critters like crazy. As the water came shooting out, it's going to lift up the basalt underneath as the continental plates slide back. As they slide back, it's going to cause it'll make what's called wrinkled mountains, folded mountains. In British Columbia, where I was yesterday, they have mountain ranges there that are obviously pushed from the end, and it's wrinkled up.
That's crazy.
Wrinkled mountains like this have to be pushed from sideways. This water came shooting out, probably would kill everything in the ocean within a few hundred miles of the cracks. Because hot water, when it's regular water, kills the fishies. If you poured a gallon of boiling water into your aquarium, you would kill the fishies within a certain radius, okay? And when hot water comes out, it does that. All over the world, diatomaceous earth is found, sometimes in huge collections like the one in Lompoc, California. Now, diatoms are really, really tiny, glass-bodied creatures. Under the microscope, they look gorgeous. There's some diatoms here. When they float around in the ocean, they die. When they sink to the bottom, then their kids die and sink to the bottom, and their grandkids die and sink to the bottom. And it takes about 1,000 years to get 1 inch of diatoms. They are so tiny. You can take diatomaceous earth, you can buy it at the hardware store, and you can sprinkle around your house, and it is so tiny, insects get it stuck in the pores of their skin, and it kills the insects. It's a good, purely natural insecticide. It's real cheap. Diatomaceous earth is used in swimming pool filters. It's used in detergents. It's used in fertilizers. It's used for kitty litter. Oil dry is made of diatomaceous earth. Well, I went out to Lompoc, California when I was preaching out there. I went and visited the largest diatomaceous earth quarry in the world, I think. The diatomaceous earth is 1,500 feet thick. They dig it out with bulldozers and huge cranes. They're digging out this diatomaceous earth. I asked the guy, the foreman at the job there, I said, "Do you find anything unusual in this diatomaceous earth?" He said, "Oh, we find millions, probably trillions of fossils." Here's a fish fossil in diatomaceous earth. These little herring are found by the billions. Actually, he gave me a chunk of diatomaceous earth from the quarry. This is it right here. It's just like chalk, so if you handle it, it's going to break. It's real lightweight. This one little square foot here probably contains 40 to 60 fish fossils. Can you see the skeletons in there? Just in 1 square foot. He said it's this way everywhere. What happened?
It's interesting.
They were digging in the diatomaceous earth quarry in 1976, and they came across the skeleton of a whale. A baleen whale standing on end. The whale was 80 feet long. Now, the layers of diatoms were also tilted, so it wasn't the height of the whale that becomes the problem, but the thickness of a whale, maybe 8 or 10 or 15 feet thick. Now, if it takes 1,000 years for an inch of diatoms to accumulate, how are you going to preserve an entire whale skeleton? You think the whale's going to lay at the bottom of the ocean for 50,000 years waiting to get preserved? No, I think something's going to go eat it, right? The rapid accumulation of diatoms to me indicates there was a flood when hot water came shooting out, and it just so happens Lompoc, California is right on the San Andreas fault line. I think that's one of the places where the earth cracked open, the water came out, and it killed the diatoms within a few hundred miles, and they snowed to the bottom. And the swirling waters would put them in big, huge, thick layers, and they're digging them out today. And there's a big chunk of it right there. You come see for yourself, the diatomaceous earth. The chalk cliffs of Dover, also 300 feet thick of solid chalk. Actually, the Latin word cretia means chalk. So the Cretaceous age, they talk about in the textbook, comes from the age of chalk. That's all baloney. There wasn't a chalk age. There were layers of chalk formed during the flood. Thick layers of chalk, sometimes accumulating in little piles. And this calcite would get together and end up in huge piles like they have in the chalk cliffs of Dover over there, 300 feet thick. The Bible says in Genesis 7, the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the waters. In the Hovind theory, during the first few months of the flood, dead animals would settle out. They would get buried. Swirling water would tend to make them go in little eddies or end up with fossil graveyards. Moving water, if you will go along a river during flood stage, you'll see little eddies, swirling, little mini whirlpools. Stuff tends to accumulate in those. And then when it gets buried, you'd get, piles of gravel, for instance, like they have in South Bend, Indiana. Huge gravel beds. Probably the whole Florida peninsula is all basically sand. Maybe that was a big swirling eddy that deposited a giant sandbar, which we call Florida, and live on today. This would happen during a worldwide flood. Many of the features of the earth, if you think of it from a flood perspective, this is the best explanation to explain these things. Moving water automatically sorts particles by density. Heavier stuff drops out first. As the current slows down, different stuff drops out. We've got this thing on the table here. You can play with these things all day. You can buy them at the mall. Different colors of sand. When you flip it over, as the sand drops down, it automatically makes more layers. There's only two different colors of sand in there, black and white, two different densities. Why doesn't it just make all the dark stuff at the bottom are denser and all the light stuff at the top? Instead, it always makes multiple layers. During a flood, you get the same phenomenon, not just denser at the bottom and lighter on top, you get them all mixed together. And it'll make many layers. You can watch it. We're talking about something else. You don't have to watch it. You can watch it all the time if you like. But anyway,
I think we'll stop there. We'll
multiple layering happens during a flood also.
All right, there we go. 1 hour, 30 minutes. We'll stop there. All right, so that was another enjoyable session there. A lot of good information. I just like the way Dr. Hovind teaches. He simplifies complex things and just makes it palatable for uneducated people like myself. So I can pick up on what he's talking about. It's very enjoyable. I think that's the way teaching ought to be done, and so I really, really appreciate it. And everything he says, I'm pretty much in line with his theories. I think I'm not a scientific person, so I don't know, but the theory that I mentioned at the beginning that I must have heard from Answers in Genesis, if not Hovind, makes a little bit more sense to me, but the comet thing can make sense too. Like, what we know by this is that the Ice Age does not by any means disprove a young Earth or creationism. It can certainly fit within the biblical time frame, within the historical account of the flood. It's compatible. So don't let anybody try to tell you that the Ice Age necessitates an old Earth, that it had. There's got to be hundreds of thousands or millions of years old in order for there to be an Ice Age. No, that's nonsense. But anyways, I'm pretty tired here, so I'm going to wrap up. We'll keep this exit here short. As always, I appreciate you guys watching with me. Still got a long journey ahead of us, Lord willing. So I love you guys, and we'll talk to you next time.